Thank you very much. Good day, everybody. I'm not going to have a presentation. I'm going to just talk, and that has advantages and disadvantages. It means you have to concentrate on what I'm saying, but it also means that I'm going to have to make a big effort to emphasize the points that I think are particularly important. And in some way, it may be a little bit challenging for all of us, for you and for me. I hope I'll succeed in dealing with this challenge effectively. I'm going to talk about the interaction of economics and politics in what I call the European crisis. I'm very glad that we've just had the session that we have, where basically you've been shown all the data that you need as background to what I'm going to talk about. I think these two talks will dovetail rather well. I want to talk more about ideas in economics and their interaction with the law and with politics in this European crisis that we're living through at the moment. But I want to start off with just a few words about something I remember from when I was a student of economics, well, more than 40 years ago, starting out on my economics master's degree at the LSE. And I'd studied international relations and history before. And those were the mid-70s when we were going through this great intellectual shift from old-fashioned Keynesianism to monetarism still. We hadn't got on to neo-Keynesianism and new classical and all that stuff. We were taught fairly standard Keynesian economics. And I had a lot of difficulty in understanding the standard Keynesian economics that we were taught. I found it very hard to understand how these little blocks of demand, the C and the I and the G, how they were created and how they could be increased or reduced. It just intuitively, it seemed to me always that goods that people buy have a mixture of characteristics. They can't simply be separated into blocks. Of course, it later turned out that in slightly more sophisticated versions, indeed, consumer durables are closer to investment goods, for example. But leaving that aside, and I found this really very hard to understand, and I just didn't understand how the policymakers thought that they could simply change these blocks. And intuitively, I was much more of a monetarist. I could understand how the flow of money could be expected to increase demand or rein in inflation, depending on the situation. And then I read a book by somebody who was here last year, Victoria Chick, who was already then professor of economics at University College. And I think it was called The Theory of Macroeconomic Policy, something like that. Orange book, softback. And she said something like this, that Keynes's big insight was that there are situations where the only way to deliver money effectively to the economy so that it really increases demand, but as money, is through a government deficit. In other words, that we're not talking about fiscal policy as one kind of policy, and monetary policy as a completely different policy, and the twain shall never meet. But that there are situations in which fiscal policy is the only effective monetary policy, right? But of course that requires, and if you like, the only effective monetary policy is fiscal policy financed by money creation. And I said I've started off with that because I think you'll see, if I'm right, that we've actually found ourselves back in that kind of situation. And that this, in a sense, an understanding of this is probably essential if the European or the West European crisis is to be resolved. Now, the title of my talk is Europe in Crisis. Actually, I don't need this. The title of my talk is Europe in Crisis, and in fact there are two crises. The first, which we've been hearing a lot about just very recently, is what I call the Russian crisis. It's not a Ukrainian crisis. It's Russia challenging the fundamentals of international law, which are the basis on which the post-Cold War order was founded. And it's a very serious, indeed life-threatening, and not just necessarily in eastern Ukraine, crisis. But there's the other crisis, and that's the one I'm going to talk about the most, or for most of the rest of this talk, and that's the West European crisis. And that crisis is rooted in the Eurozone crisis. Since 2010, it's been clear that the Eurozone doesn't have institutions that can pursue effective common monetary and fiscal policy. In other words, we've created a currency area where there aren't institutions for effective common monetary and fiscal policy. There are institutions for national fiscal policy. There are non-effective institutions for effective monetary policy. I think what you've just seen is what you've just been told about the porcupine effect, but not only. The record of the Eurozone over the last 3 years, and particularly 2012, 2013, 2014, and probably 2015, shows that common monetary policy, although it exists, is not effective. But there's also absolutely no provision for common fiscal policy, and certainly not for a combination of monetary and fiscal policy in the way I've described, or in the way that Victoria Chick described. And this has led to stagnation in the north of Europe. If we take the powerhouse of the European economy, Germany, cumulative growth since 2007 has been cumulative growth, 6%. And depression in the south. And this, of course, has led to political crisis in Greece, quite probably in Spain after the elections in December of this year, and quite the greatest political crisis of all, which the European Union will face if Marine Le Pen is elected President of France in 2017, which is certainly not impossible. The result of this stagnation and depression has been a bilateral breakdown in solidarity between the North and the South in Europe. From 2010, when the crisis began, the North has demanded responsibility from the South in exchange for its solidarity. But there have been three problems with this. First of all, the solidarity was insufficiently large to allow the South to avoid depression. Secondly, the responsibility was insufficient to ensure recovery. And by the way, I don't think it's just that the responsibility was insufficient in extent. By responsibility, the North means do your structural reforms, do what the Germans like to call your homework. But I think there are serious reasons to doubt whether structural reforms, by their nature, can bring recovery on their own without policies to increase demand as well. And I think you've, in the previous discussion, described this very well. Structural reform increases the supply side potential of the economy, but how do you get the economy to generate the actual economic output that that supply side potential can create? And will the supply side potential actually be created, in effect, through new investment, if people expect the demand to be low for the foreseeable future? And the result has been that in 2012 the Eurozone crisis was calmed, but it wasn't resolved. And as you all know, it's just come back with a vengeance as a result of the election of the Syriza government in Greece. The result of this collapse in mutual solidarity between Northern Europe and Southern Europe is that when the North itself came to need solidarity from the South in the face of Russian aggression in the East, and this is after all extremely important not only to Finland, not only to Estonia, not only to Latvia, these are all austerity-friendly, austerity-enthusiastic countries, but also to Germany, and not irrelevant to Austria. It's not surprising that when the North came to need solidarity in the face of Russian aggression from the South, it found that it was fairly thin on the ground, that solidarity. Solidarity is a two-way street, or at least should be. Now, you may think that I'm being insufficiently Deutsche Versteher. I don't know how many of you know the German expression Putin Versteher, somebody who understands the beautiful soul of the Russian president. And you may feel that I'm not being sufficiently Deutsche Versteher, that I don't understand the emotions and the thinking that the Germans are coming from. In fact, that's not the case. I think that the Germans are absolutely right when they say the following: that the Maastricht Treaty explicitly makes each state responsible for its own finances. They're right when they say that the Maastricht Treaty bans monetary financing of deficits. They're right when they say that the French wanted the euro so as to hijack the Bundesbank. They're right when they say that they warned everybody in advance that they wouldn't let that happen. They're right when they say that they've actually compromised on many of their most cherished principles in order to save the euro. All these points are perfectly true. Unfortunately, they're largely irrelevant. And the reasons they're irrelevant are, first of all, because, as I said earlier, structural reform cannot lead to recovery in a large, closed economy like the Eurozone. even in a small open economy, you typically also need depreciation together with structural reform for recovery to take place. Secondly, it's true, the Germans are right to say that after World War II, there was never a clear need for activist macroeconomic policy. Unfortunately, until 2009, when that need appeared. Keynes is right extremely rarely, about once in every 70 years. But this is when he was right, having been right in the 1930s. The third point is, of course, that the collapse of the Eurozone would be a catastrophe, both economic and political, not only for Europe, but maybe above all for Germany itself. And the fourth, and I think that's already evident from what I've said, is that economic policy isn't happening in a political void. The failures of Eurozone economic policy are generating political crises that are making the are generating political crises that mean that it's not just a matter of avoiding 7 or 10 wasted years when we could have had growth and we're not going to have it because we don't have an activist macroeconomic policy. It's actually creating the risk of a major political and economic catastrophe in Europe. As I said at the beginning, this is one of those rare times when fiscal and monetary policy have to be harnessed together if recovery is to be achieved. And this is because the opponents of fiscal expansion are right when they say that the high levels of debt that the world and public debt that the world and particularly Europe entered the crisis with in 2007, even Germany entered the crisis with a debt to GDP ratio of public debt to GDP ratio of over 80%, means that large sustained fiscal deficits may threaten national default. And for that reason, as we all know, if we've done some of our new classical economics, fiscal deficits that increase the debt to GDP ratio may not even be effective in increasing demand. And the opponents of expansionary monetary policy are also right to say that expansionary monetary policy may not increase effective demand in the economy because the credit channel is blocked because of what has happened in the banking system, and that huge money balances may create asset bubbles that will burst down the line, causing further crisis. In fact, the answer to these two criticisms of the ineffectiveness of monetary policy and the dangers likely to stem from it, and the possible ineffectiveness of fiscal policy because of the starting position that we're in with high debt, actually allow us to devise a fairly simple answer to both of these problems at the same time. That would be to increase effective demand by running large fiscal deficits and to avoid increases in consolidated public debt by financing them through the European Central Bank. Because the debt that the European Central Bank buys ultimately belongs to the government, and in the consolidated accounts is cancelled with the liabilities of the government. This has the added advantage of generating less bubble risk for a given increase in effective demand for goods, services, and employment, because the money is spent by government not on buying shares or other assets, hopefully, but on building infrastructure, paying for cheaper, or subsidizing, for example, education, and on other things that go directly to people who'll spend the money and increase demand in the economy. So today, monetary financing of large budget deficits is probably the best way to generate recovery and maybe the best way to save the Eurozone. There is, though, one small problem, and that is that monetary financing of large budget, well, of any budget deficits, has effectively been deconstitutionalized in the Maastricht Treaty, and actually also in many national legal systems and in some national constitutions, such as that of Poland. So, what can be done? The German political elite needs to explain the facts of life to German voters. German voters need to understand that they're feeling that this is not the Eurozone they signed up to, and that in fact they've either been cheated or are in the process of being cheated, while justified, is actually irrelevant. We are where we are. You all know the joke about the drunk who was asked the way to Dublin Castle and said, "Oh, if I were going to Dublin Castle, I'd start from here." Well, I think, none of us would like to start from here. This is not a good place. This is where we are. And this is what we have to deal with, where we are. And it's irrelevant that the Germans thought they were signing up to a different Eurozone. So did the French. So finally, I'd say that the rules of the Eurozone, or at least their spirit, have to be broken for everybody to be able to be better off, including, of course, Germany. And if they aren't, or if not broken, at least circumvented, then everybody, including Germany, will be far worse off. In life, there are things that are worse, sometimes there are things that are worse than being cheated. But what about the crowning German argument about moral hazard? If we pursue this policy of expansion, then there will be moral hazard, and nobody will exhibit any discipline in terms of their fiscal policy or the structural reforms that they introduce. Now, unlike the other German points or German arguments, I think that this one is both true and not entirely irrelevant. But I think it's not nearly as insurmountable as it seems to the naysayers. The reason it looks so daunting to the naysayers is that they imagine expansionary macroeconomic policy as a series of rescues of the Greek type. And of course, if expansionary macroeconomic policy were a series of rescues, then of course it's true that it would create moral hazard, because one person having been rescued would encourage others to expect to be rescued. But if instead we had a common Eurozone expansionary monetary fiscal macroeconomic policy, which avoided increasing consolidated debt to GDP, either through ECB financing or through some other method, then the rules around that policy could quite easily be designed so that those with the lowest debt sustainability problems would benefit most from the expansionary policy as far as its direct effects were concerned. In other words, we'd be we'd be spending money on education in Germany. We'd be building roads in Holland. We'd be investing in research and development, if we think that's a suitable activity for government, in Finland. While those with high sustainability problems and serious structural problems would benefit indirectly through the increase in demand in the rest of the Eurozone. And if we had that kind of a structure, there wouldn't be the moral hazard problem, the moral hazard problems that are usually raised. It's always nicer to be able to directly benefit, particularly as far as the political system is concerned, to be able to hand out goodies. That wouldn't be possible in the countries with high debt, high structural problems. They would benefit, but indirectly through the recovery in the Eurozone as a whole. So, such an approach would be incentive compatible, as we economists like to say, and would avoid moral hazard. But what about the legal problems with monetary financing? Well, I happen to believe that where there's an understanding of the common interest, these can always be circumvented, either by quantitative easing, which pretends to be a monetary policy, but which in fact would be a combination of monetary and fiscal, or through development bank infrastructural investments on a massive scale outside the official public sector, or through ways of effectively raiding the huge cash piles of many large corporations which don't want to invest. I'm not suggesting necessarily to tax them, but to induce, well, during the Second World War there was such a thing as forced savings. One could imagine some degree of forced investment. I think that would be the worst of the three solutions, but probably less bad than sustaining the present policy. So, almost certainly less bad than this present policy. So the conclusion is, my conclusion would be that at the height of the Austrian counter-revolution in economics in the 1970s and 1980s, it was claimed by some that there was actually no proof that it was Keynesian policies that brought the Great Depression to an end. Well, today we have an opportunity to test that proposition. I hope to God that we're sensible enough not to take that opportunity and to remain in ignorance. Thank you very much.